Well, good morning, everyone. You know, only in a Unitarian Universalist church would you have an agnostic introduced by an atheist to talk about Jesus. But here you are. When I began work on this talk, I asked myself, how confident was I that the story of the Sermon on the Mount, and the Beatitudes in particular, as recounted in the Gospel of Matthew, was true, and that I understood what was being said? I asked myself three questions. Did Jesus really exist? Or was he a well-constructed myth? Were these words he actually spoke? That is, does the particular translation that I'm reading accurately reflect the true sense of what he said? Did I know enough about the cultural context of those times and in that place to really understand his meaning, his intent, and his effect upon his listeners? So let me start with the first question. Did the personage of Jesus actually exist? A tough one. Like our 19th century Unitarian forebears, as I described here in my talk, if those of you were here on February 6th, I cannot believe in the divinity of Jesus. But I do believe he existed and was a great teacher and prophet, a man who saw things differently than others and who developed a radically new philosophy, and a philosophy of life based upon love, goodness, hope, equality, humility. He believed, as we Jews do, in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That's what he did. As a teacher, he was very much like an Eastern guru, like the Buddha in very, very many ways. He literally inverted the structure of society. He turned it upside down by declaring that it was not the rich and powerful that were blessed, but rather the poor, the mourners, the humble. In this Jesus, I believe. Second, did he speak those particular words as translated in the Bible? Of course, Jesus spoke Aramaic, a language that is nearly dead today. The Bible was written in ancient Greek. It was translated into Latin sometime back, way back when, and eventually recopied over and over again in the European monasteries in the early centuries, and eventually in the present-day English, and over 3,000 other languages. There are at least 70 different English translations, and each translation puts its own bias of the writer into the story. The writer Matthew was not the Matthew I knew growing up to be one of Jesus' 12 apostles. That surprised me. Rather, he was a person or persons who wrote somewhere around the year 80, about 50 years after the death of Jesus. His sources, rather than contemporaneous first-hand accounts, were the recollections of storytellers. That's how most of the information was carried back then. There was no internet. And Bible scholars agree his sources were the Gospels of Mark and Luke. He may have been the first great plagiarist, really. And most importantly, the original papyrus scriptures are long since perished. Papyrus just does not last that long. So no one knows exactly what was written. So, could we resolve the question of Jesus' existence and language and proceed to learn from this teacher? In that regard, we can take shelter in the wise words of Mohandas Gandhi, who said the following. I love this. He said, quote, "I can say that the historical Jesus never interested me. Nothing would change for me if someone proved that Jesus never lived and that the gospel narration was a fictitious story, because the message of the Sermon on the Mount would always remain true for me." You heard Mike talk about Kurt Vonnegut, the famous author, Unitarian Universalist, and humanist, who rejected the divinity of Jesus, but was nonetheless an ardent admirer. He believed that Jesus' Beatitudes informed his own humanism. And so it is for me. and so it is, I hope, for all of you. As to the third question, the historical context of his words, this we know. The Jews had no political power. Palestine at the time of Jesus was occupied by the Romans. They were the last in a long, not the last, but certainly at that time, a long line of occupation forces, including Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Syrians, and others who ruled that area for over 600 years, except for the brief period of the Maccabees. The period was marked by constant conflict and violence, public executions by crucifixion, a Roman favorite. Economic inequality was rampant throughout the Roman Empire, and especially in Palestine. It has been estimated that 3% of the population were very rich, 3%. 90% were very poor. And the middle class, skilled tradespeople, whatever, the remaining small 7%. It was estimated that 29% of the population in Palestine at the time of Jesus lived below the subsistence level. That is, they lived a day-to-day existence, never knowing where their next meal would come from. In that class-driven society, people at each succeeding lower level were treated with contempt by those above. And those with infirmities of any sort, the physically or mentally handicapped, were excluded from society. Class distinctions also prevailed within the Jewish religion at the time. The Sadducees occupied the place of highest authority in Jerusalem and collaborated with the Romans to maintain their position. The Pharisees were most associated with a common man. And both groups fought for power in the Sanhedrin, the ruling body. Samaritans, you've heard the story, of course, of the Good Samaritan, were hated by the Jews. And conversely, if they would meet each other in the street, they just wouldn't even acknowledge each other. As you would expect, crime was rampant, and a lonely traveler on the roads would be in great danger. And then along came Jesus, and the world truly has never been the same. I chose the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Mike and I were talking about that earlier, because that was the one recommended to me by my professors during my brief, unfortunately, tenure at the UU Seminary. And I had it on my desk. I already paid for it. So that's the one I used. I did consult my mother's 60-year-old Catholic Bible. That's sitting right there. And of course, which I have somewhere around here, my Kindle Bible. What else but my Kindle Bible? It's actually called the Kindle Bible. You can download the King James Version or you can download the Kindle version. I downloaded the Kindle. That's the way it is today. So, from Amazon.com. So now let me introduce the Beatitudes. These are Matthew, of course, chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. And I'm going to start with a few initial observations. First, the Sermon on the Mount constitutes Matthew 5, 6, and 7, of which the Beatitudes is only a small portion of chapter 5. It's generally believed that the Sermon on the Mount is a record of Jesus' teaching to his disciples, not directly to the people, because he didn't teach that way. He taught people who then taught, because everything was by word of mouth. It was not one lesson, but probably a series of lectures or lessons that he gave. This sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, is regarded by many as the Magna Carta or manifesto of Christianity. And the teaching events recorded constituted the process of ordination of the 12 apostles. That's the story. That's what the biblical scholars believe. The word beatitude itself is derived from the Latin word beatus and is believed to be the translation of the original Greek word makarios, meaning happy or blissful or blessed. The wording in the Beatitudes, and this is very important, is not expressed in individual terms, but in group or societal terms. Jesus' call for society's improvement and for individuals to recognize their role in that society. It's worded not as blessed is a person, but blessed are they, a group.